On September 19, 1959, Marilyn Monroe was at 20th Century Fox as Nikita Khrushchev arrived in Hollywood. In a few hours, the most famous film actress in America and the leader of the Soviet Union would be standing face to face. Hollywood had specifically wanted Marilyn there. Her husband, Arthur Miller, was not with her, and his political past made that absence complicated. Around them, American and Soviet security were checking the studio grounds and the food. A planned trip to Disneyland was already turning into a diplomatic problem. The real question isn't whether Marilyn Monroe met Nikita Khrushchev. She did. The question is why anyone thought she needed to. To understand why that afternoon mattered, it helps to know what had already happened that week. Khrushchev's visit was the first by a Soviet leader to the United States at this level, and it came at a moment when the two countries held enough combined weaponry to end most life on the planet. Berlin remained a live source of tension between them. 2 months earlier, Khrushchev had traded pointed arguments with Vice President Nixon in a Moscow kitchen exhibit, an exchange that made headlines around the world and became known simply as the kitchen debate. Now President Eisenhower had invited him to see the United States for himself, and his itinerary, running from mid to late September, took him from Washington to New York to Los Angeles and beyond, through factories, farms, and finally a film studio. Hollywood was one stop on a tour that both governments were treating as genuine diplomacy, however strange the setting. By the time Khrushchev reached California, American newspapers had spent days covering his every remark, every meal, every gesture, looking for signs of what kind of man he actually was. A lunch with movie stars gave both sides something the earlier stops hadn't: cameras, glamour, and a setting where ordinary Americans might recognize every face in the room. 20th Century Fox in 1959 was still operating largely under the old studio system, the arrangement that had defined Hollywood for 3 decades, where contract stars, directors, and technicians worked under one roof and one authority. That system was already beginning to loosen, but it meant Fox could summon its stars, its sound stages, and its commissary for an event like this on short notice, in a way that would have been far harder a decade later. The studio that had built its fortune on musicals and melodramas was, for one afternoon, functioning almost like an arm of American diplomacy. 9 days before the luncheon, a telegram had arrived for Marilyn from Eric Johnston, president of the Motion Picture Association of America. It told her that Khrushchev would be in Los Angeles the following week, and that a luncheon was being organized at 20th Century Fox in connection with his visit. She was invited. A similar telegram sent to Bob Hope survives today in the Library of Congress. Marilyn had not simply been standing nearby when Khrushchev arrived. She had been asked, formally, by the organization representing the American film industry. By the day of the luncheon, roughly 400 guests had been assembled. 405 according to one contemporary Los Angeles Times account. Frank Sinatra was there. So were Elizabeth Taylor, Gary Cooper, Judy Garland, Kirk Douglas, Henry Fonda, and Bob Hope, along with dozens of other names that filled the marquees of the period. A few prominent conservatives, including Ronald Reagan and Bing Crosby, chose to stay away, a small sign of how politically charged the day already was before Khrushchev had even landed. For everyone else, an invitation to the Café de Paris that afternoon had become one of the most sought-after tickets in the history of the studio. By September 1959, Marilyn was already one of the most recognizable film stars in the world. The success of Some Like It Hot had only reinforced that status. There were very few American faces in 1959 as widely recognized outside the United States as hers, and Hollywood understood exactly what that kind of recognition was worth to an afternoon built around American prestige. The film industry had spent much of the decade positioning itself as an informal ambassador for American culture abroad, and a luncheon built around a Soviet leader was, in part, an opportunity to put that idea on display in front of the world's press. On September 18th, she was photographed with Arthur Miller at Idlewild Airport in New York before Marilyn's flight to Los Angeles, one more press moment in a marriage that had already spent years under public observation. Contemporary captions connect the trip to the following day's luncheon, though she also had professional reasons for the trip. She was preparing to begin a new picture, then called The Billionaire, later released as Let's Make Love. When reporters asked whether she had come to see Khrushchev, she didn't deflect. Asked if he might want to see her too, her reported answer was simple, "I hope he does." Arthur Miller did not receive the same welcome. Demand for invitations was overwhelming, and organizers had placed limits on spouses, with exceptions for couples who were both stars. Miller didn't fit that exception, and there was more to it than logistics. 3 years earlier, in 1956, he had been called before the House Un-American Activities Committee and had refused to name others who had attended meetings he was asked about, resulting in a contempt of Congress citation. The conviction was overturned on appeal in 1958, only a year before the luncheon, but the episode had made him one of the more politically visible American writers of the decade. By later accounts, that history made him an awkward guest for an event built around Cold War diplomacy. There is no record of an official order keeping him out. What later accounts describe instead is a quieter understanding. Organizers preferred that he not attend. Marilyn was welcomed. Her husband's presence was considerably more complicated. At the Beverly Hills Hotel, she prepared with her usual team, Ralph Roberts, Sidney Gilleroff, Alan Whitey Snyder. She was famous for arriving late to nearly everything, a habit that had cost directors and co-stars hours of waiting on more than one production. That day, by most accounts, she was early, dressed and ready well before the cars were due to leave for the studio. Khrushchev's plane landed in Los Angeles around 9 minutes past noon. The luncheon was scheduled for 12:30, leaving barely enough time for the motorcade to reach the studio through streets already lined with police and onlookers. American and Soviet security checked the grounds, the shrubbery, the restrooms, even the table decorations. A Los Angeles police forensic specialist reportedly used a Geiger counter to check the food for radioactive contamination before it reached the tables, a level of precaution that said as much about the era as anything spoken that day. Secret Service agents worked alongside their Soviet counterparts, an arrangement that would have been unthinkable a few years earlier, and the press pool assigned to cover the visit was larger than almost anything Fox had handled for a single event. Inside the Café de Paris, Khrushchev and his wife Nina were seated among the studio's most prominent names. The commissary itself had been built years earlier as an ordinary studio dining hall, the kind of place where crews normally ate between takes on ordinary shooting days. For one afternoon it had been reset with the formality of a state banquet, its usual lunch trays replaced by place settings meant for a foreign head of state. Marilyn was not beside Khrushchev. Reconstructions of the seating place her at a different table, with producer David Brown, director Joshua Logan, and Henry Fonda. Fox's president, Spyro Skouras, addressed Khrushchev directly. Skouras had arrived in America as a poor Greek immigrant with almost nothing, worked his way up through the theater business city by city, and eventually risen to run one of the largest studios in the world. He offered that story as evidence for what his adopted country had made possible for a man willing to work for it. Khrushchev answered with a biography of his own, a shepherd, then a factory worker, then a coal miner, before rising through the Communist Party to lead the Soviet Union. Two men, in the middle of a Hollywood lunch, each pointing to his own life as proof that his system, and not the others, was the one that actually let a poor man rise. Around the tables, guests who had come expecting entertainment found themselves watching something closer to a live debate between two competing visions of the 20th century. Khrushchev had also wanted, badly, to visit Disneyland during his stay. It had been built up in Soviet press coverage as a symbol of American life, and Khrushchev seemed genuinely curious to see it for himself. Police told organizers they could not guarantee his safety in an open, crowded park, and the visit was canceled. He didn't take the news quietly. Speaking to the assembled press, he asked what exactly the park was hiding: rocket launch sites, an outbreak of cholera, gangsters with machine guns. The recording of his complaint survives in archival collections, a Soviet premier audibly offended at being kept from an amusement park in the middle of a nuclear standoff. After lunch, Khrushchev's party began moving through the studio toward Stage 8, where Can-Can was in production, a lavish musical built around Cole Porter songs and directed by Walter Lang. Spyro Skouras spotted Marilyn along the way and brought her forward to introduce her. And for a moment the crowd of photographers and security around Khrushchev closed in on the two of them together. Khrushchev's reported greeting was brief. "You're a very lovely young lady." Photographers pushed closer as the two shook hands, and for a moment the crowd of reporters, security men, and studio guests around them nearly overwhelmed the introduction itself. It lasted only a few minutes. There was no private conversation afterward, no second meeting, nothing beyond the handshake, a few sentences, and the photographs that circulated in newspapers the following day. Marilyn answered by sending a greeting from her husband. The man whose absence had made that afternoon a little more complicated was now, through her, part of the conversation anyway. Then she added a line that has been preserved with some consistency: "There should be more of this kind of thing. It would help both our countries understand each other." She held no government position. She was not negotiating anything, and nothing about American or Soviet policy changed because of what she said. But she had been brought into that room largely as a symbol of American glamour, and when she was finally given a sentence of her own, she chose to talk about two countries understanding one another. Marilyn later described Khrushchev's expression in her own words: "He looked at me the way a man looks on a woman." It's her recollection, offered afterward, not a documented account of what he was thinking. Nothing in the record suggests anything beyond a brief, public, heavily chaperoned introduction. One further story comes from a different kind of source. Marilyn's longtime maid, Lena Pepitone, remembered Marilyn being told the Soviets associated America with two things above nearly everything else: Coca-Cola and Marilyn Monroe. Pepitone also recalled the studio encouraging one of her more revealing dresses for the occasion, and remembered Marilyn answering with a dry line of her own about how little sex there must be in Russia. This is a later memoir, not a contemporary record, and it should be treated as one, a colorful detail worth mentioning, not a documented fact about studio instructions. From there, Khrushchev's group continued to Stage 8, where Frank Sinatra helped welcome them onto the Can-Can set. Dancers who had been rehearsing all morning performed for a Soviet premier who, only minutes earlier, had been arguing about economic systems and demanding to know why he couldn't go to Disneyland. Khrushchev watched part of the number and later criticized it publicly as indecent, a complaint that made its own headlines the next day and gave American papers one more strange detail to add to an already strange afternoon. A studio lunch had turned into an argument about economic systems. A canceled trip to a theme park had become an international incident. And somewhere in between, Marilyn Monroe had shaken hands with the leader of the Soviet Union and talked briefly about understanding. None of it had been planned as a single story. It had simply all happened on the same afternoon, inside the same studio, within a few hours of each other. By evening, wire services around the world were running photographs of the two of them together, filed alongside reports on Khrushchev's Disneyland complaint and his verdict on the Can-Can. Khrushchev's tour still had more than a week left to run, farmland in Iowa, and another round of talks in Washington still ahead of him. For one afternoon, though, the itinerary had brought the Cold War itself into a Hollywood commissary, and left it there long enough for a single photograph of a Soviet premier shaking hands with Marilyn Monroe to travel further than almost anything else said or done that week. Later that day, a reporter asked Marilyn what she made of the afternoon. "It's a very interesting afternoon." Asked what she'd found most interesting, she said, "Nearly everything."
From an entertainer's point of view, what did you think of the show today?
It was a very interesting afternoon.
What did you find most interesting?
Nearly everything.
What do you think of the ad libs?
Interesting. Very interesting.
Is this what you expected here today? What did you come expecting?
Roast beef.
I expected it to be interesting.